Hello, and welcome to Books in Action. I'm Jennifer Latimer. And tonight, I have with me columnist David Weiner. David is a Heard on the Street columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and he writes about healthcare. He previously covered markets, business, economics, and international affairs for Bloomberg News. David spent over a decade as a correspondent in Israel before moving to New York in 2018. He was awarded the very prestigious award for his coverage of China's effort to reshape the United Nations during the Donald Trump presidency. David was born and raised in Rio de Janeiro and has a bachelor's degree in finance from Boston University's Questrom School of Business. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And you are our first guest of 2022-2023. So this is exciting. So I have to say, I read that whole piece of your bio because I was fascinated by your biography. And I was hoping we could start there with some questions on that. I wanted to unpack your start in Rio de Janeiro. How long did you live there?
I was there until I was 14.
Okay.
At which point my family moved to Miami.
Excellent. Now, was your family there for a long time, or is it a stopping point along a parent's journey?
All my grandparents grew up there.
Okay.
They each sort of made their way there from different parts of Europe and North Africa. My grandmother was from Morocco and Polish, Russian.
Okay.
And they all ended up in Brazil as immigrants, somewhere in the 20th century.
Okay.
And my parents grew up there, so I very much felt Brazilian growing up.
Okay. There's nothing going on in Brazil right now, so there's probably nothing to talk about currently, but kidding. What was your relationship to reading, libraries, like the written word as a child?
Well, so I went to, at age 5, my parents transferred me to American school. It's called Escola Americana do Rio de Janeiro, the American School of Rio de Janeiro. So I was basically growing up bilingual at that point. We had a nice library there, so I was reading books both in Portuguese and English. Okay. And my mother's she's a writer as well. And so as a kid,
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Let's put a pin in that. I'm very curious to come back to that. Okay.
But so as a child, not only would I sort of witness her sort of with her piles of notes on her desk, staying up late into the night, writing as writers often do, but also I would attend her, book parties,
right.
With her. So I think all that really stuck with me.
Was she a parent that, if I can ask this, that sort of brought you along? Because it sounds like you went to her book parties. I know when I was growing up, my mother thought nothing of bringing me to her if she had friends over, she allowed me to sit in with them.
Right.
So it sort of always felt like a very grown-up thing to do, and people would ask me my opinions. Did you get to interact with her writing community?
Yeah, we definitely felt, me and my sister, we were involved. For example, I remember sitting at the booth selling her books, and collecting the cash. Or one memory I have also was when I first discovered that, hey, maybe you can make money from writing. She had this little stuffy that she had kept from when she was young. Child, and she told me that I could write stories about that stuffy and sell them for money. And I was for a few days I was very serious, and I worked on that, and I really had this intention of publishing these best-selling books about her stuffy. But so that kind of
kindled. But you can see it, it's tangible.
Right.
I always tell people, once you see it, it becomes something, or somebody believes in you, right? That idea then grows.
Exactly.
Right? Somebody sees me as a writer.
Right. Right.
So, your mother is the gardener there. So, may I ask, just as a total tangent, what kind of writing did your mother do?
Well, she had been a lawyer in Brazil, and her first books were about the legal system.
Okay.
And then she branched out and did some other passion projects, focusing on our family that survived the Holocaust, and sort of big part of her family from Poland perished there, so she did a project and went back to Poland to where my grandfather, was from, a small town called Zaklikov. Later, I went to this town as well, and just sort of unpacking that whole story.
Right. Which again, there's nothing going on right now that would really have relevance to that.
Right.
All of these things, and you're like all of your experiences are still like, I feel like, very worldly at this moment in at where we are. So now you're in Miami, and eventually you get to Boston University and you get a bachelor's degree in business. Did you see a future in writing then? Were you thinking you were going to go into the business world? Talk to me about what was college David's experience like with literacy?
Yeah. And that's a good question. I mean, when I first enrolled, I thought, economics, business, that whole world interested me. And I think it was when I went abroad for a semester at Hebrew University in Jerusalem.
Okay.
I just went from being this guy, that was in Boston, pretty, nice student town, and then kind of just going into Jerusalem. And I was just so intrigued by the situation there, the conflict, but also the people there. And that's what really sparked my interest and made me want to explore. Right. And then writing and journalism became a vehicle through which I could explore that world. Right. And so then I started to...
And get paid.
Right,
like make it a career.
Right. So the senior year is when I started to pivot and I started doing some freelance work. At that point, I did my first piece was about the students mobilizing. This was around 2007, 2008, and it was like the whole situation in Darfur and Sudan. And so the first piece that I wrote was about students trying to really organize and mobilize for action on the issue of Sudan. And then it just went from there.
So nice light topic to start on. Glad you haven't slowed down, right? Keep the heavy hitting going. Now, so you spent a semester in Israel, but then you also spent a decade, correct, in Israel?
Right.
Did that happen right after college? Like, did you just feel the calling and need to embed yourself there?
Right. Yeah. So after college, I decided, hey, I want to try this journalism thing. And I thought that if I just went back there, that would be a way, to do something I was still very fascinated by, but also it would be a good way to try and start journalism and try it out. Journalism is not, something that, it's really hard to sort of get your foot in the door because there's just not a lot of jobs in journalism. Right. So I freelanced for a while for some local publications, and then eventually, I got my foot in the door and I started writing about business there as well. Right. And so that's kind of how it all started.
Okay, so you use your business degree, then you use your passion, you use your international sort of comfort, I don't want to call it, right? I feel like you've... Often when I talk to people who've never gone abroad, there's that fear of, well, when I go abroad and I don't know something, right? What do I do? But I feel like with you starting and then coming here and then going, I don't know, like that maybe was not a fear, maybe it was, but... I'd like to think in my head the story would be that it was not as much of a hurdle.
No, it's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I think when you move as a young child, perhaps that does open up your eyes to different experiences and make you a little more malleable.
Now, were you able to speak the language fluently? Because I know you're multilingual. So did you speak Hebrew?
I didn't speak it when I first got there, but I did learn it just by taking an intensive course and then watching a lot of movies. I used to just because I don't like sitting in the classroom and learning a language, but I would rent movies. At that time, they were still doing DVDs, and I would just write down everything they were saying and then say it back out loud to myself. And that was how I found that I could learn.
See, when I lived in Spain, I would also go to the movies, and I would watch American movies that were dubbed into Spanish because I knew what was happening, so I could totally follow along with it, and then I would just hopefully connect what I knew with the new language.
Exactly.
And it was much more fun than maybe just reading or something like that, which I say that reading, but it was another way of kind of doing it. Also watched a lot of sports because soccer, international football,
you're trying to make learning fun.
Hearing it differently.
Right.
Plus, I live with somebody who refused to speak English, so when you get hungry, you start to really learn words, right?
That's very useful.
When the need-based learning kicks in, and you're like, I need to go into survival mode.
Yes.
So,
yes.
all right.
Yes.
Then, so you've got the business, you're writing, you're getting established. Was the social media when you were in Israel? I'm trying to put what I know about the timeline of that kind of writing, that kind of journalism. Was that big then?
The whole social media
Yeah, like
universe.
Twitter, all that stuff back then.
All that stuff was getting
there.
started. Yeah, and I mean certainly Facebook was.
Right.
People were already Facebook was already pretty much established at that point.
Because I feel like sometimes now people who are starting out in those fields, they have that is like an entry point for them.
Yes.
But it wasn't as big as of a driver as maybe now it is.
No, but social media, and if there's one sort of event that really connects for me with social media was around 2011 when all the uprisings around the world took place.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Right.
When all of a sudden you couldn't get the story, right? Any place in maybe traditional media, or you didn't think you were getting everything, but you get this like person on the street story.
Right.
Right, like what's really happening.
Right. But also, not only that, but social media was really helped to spark a lot of those protests and became the story in many ways, right? Like,
That's
the
true.
Tahrir revolution in Egypt was, a lot of the people in these protests were sharing stuff on social media.
Organizing.
And just uprisings all around the Middle East, some of which I witnessed as a reporter. And even in Israel, where I was, there was a big protest at the time, right around the time that in Tahrir Square, they were protesting, a variety of things, including the lack of democracy, but also just the price of stuff.
Right.
In Israel, there was the big cottage cheese protest, and it was like basically thousands of Israelis set up tent all around central Tel Aviv in this Rothschild Boulevard, and they just slept in these tents, and they were protesting the price of the increase in the price of cottage cheese. But then it sort of became this middle class, sort of, demand for a better cost of living, better quality of life.
It's not just the cottage cheese.
No, it started with the cottage cheese.
It's just one small microcosm of the world's issues.
Exactly.
Yes, I could go off on that. That it again very relevant to I feel like conversations that happen all the time now. It's
cost of living, yeah.
Is it the gas or is it the gas that's symbolic of so many other things,
Right.
like in the lack of control and everything else like that? So 10 years in Israel?
Just about that.
Just about-
Actually, maybe even more. Yeah.
What was there like a catalyst then to end that part of your life, that chapter, so to speak?
I would say there were probably many reasons, family and professional. But I'd say from a professional, since we're talking about just like the trajectory of my career, for me, like as a journalist, I felt that, as a foreign correspondent, you're not, you don't get to sort of, zero in on a topic that you're really passionate about. You get to tell the story from like sort of, 30,000 feet up. You're like providing the panoramic view to the outside reader back home, right? In my case, the American or the English speaking reader.
Right.
So there was something in me that really wanted to come back to the US, which was my home, and sort of then zoom in on like issues that I care about.
Right.
Which is something I couldn't do in Israel. I couldn't be part of the conversation because as much as I spoke Hebrew, I couldn't step into an Israeli Hebrew daily paper and be like focusing on issues that I thought were interesting.
Right. No, I mean it makes complete sense. You're the other.
Right.
You could be a great other.
Right.
Right. You could be a very accomplished other, but you're not. You're not of that. And I feel like sometimes you have to. When you're, you know what I mean. Anyway, I completely understand that. So the transition. We're going to take a break in a minute, and then we'll come back to pick up because then I'd love to figure out then the transition point then to healthcare, right? So that whole next chapter. So thank you so much. Stay with us as we go to break. This is Books in Action. I'm Jennifer Latimer.
When a child is sick, there's one thing they need: a really big cookie.
Welcome to RMHC.
And parents of sick children have tons of decisions to make. Like movie night, game night, or should we finish that book tonight? We don't perform surgeries, just talent shows. We're not big on poking sticks and beeping machines, but we're the best at playing dress up. Well, we have a few beeping machines. We think the tooth fairy should travel everywhere. And while hospitals have doctors and nurses, we have mom and dad. We don't provide treatment, but we do provide dogs. And we throw some really good parties. Because at Ronald McDonald House Charities,
We are home.
we help families feel at home, even when they can't be.
welcome back to Books in Action. I'm Jennifer Latimer, and tonight I'm here with David Weiner. Thank you for sticking with us here. We're going to transition now. So we talked a little bit about your writing and business, and now I'm kind of curious. You come back to the United States. How does healthcare come into this? I mean, give me a little overview of how that next part of your writing kind of life.
Sure. So in those 10 years that I was in Israel, a part of the time I did write about healthcare.
Okay.
Because one of the largest companies in the world at the time, and certainly the largest company in Israel, is this company called Teva Pharmaceuticals that makes the generic drugs that we take every day.
All day.
So that's sort of.
I'm pretty sure I've taken something with that. It's like I've seen it out of the box.
Yeah. So that's something to bear in mind. And then when I moved over to the U.S. with Bloomberg, I was a political reporter in Israel. So they moved me over to the United Nations, where they thought that would make the most sense. Okay. And I covered the UN for 3 or so years. But at the point at which I wanted to make a switch over to something else, I was bored at the UN. I realized that if I wanted to stay in politics, I'd have to move over to Washington D.C. Okay. By then, we were living here in Maplewood, and I just didn't see it happening. So that's when I realized, okay, what else am I interested in, and what else can I offer?
Right.
And healthcare was a natural place for me.
And again, so much to talk about in that decision, right?
Yeah.
You deliver yourself to a time period where there is so much.
Right.
Like some of them just say that it's just a lot the last few years. So has COVID, has pandemic isolation, has that affected the way you write? I see kids all day long at school, and we talk about how it's affected us and our ability to just focus and think. But how does it, as a writer, do you see an impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, if I could just make a comment on healthcare.
Yes, please do.
One of the things that I found absolutely fascinating and important about healthcare is that it's the largest part of our economy. It's about 20% of our GDP, right? Mm-hmm. So it's something, it's just all encompassing in terms of people's lives. It becomes such a big part of people's expenses, and it's probably one of the most, if I may say, one of the most screwed up parts of our country and economy. And we're as journalists, we're supposed to, we try not to opine on anything too controversial, but I don't think it's very controversial to say that there needs a lot of fixing needs to be done with healthcare.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I even think about, like, socially, when I get together with other women and we think about how many times we've gone to a doctor and not really sure that they actually know what we're talking about, right? Like, do medical books really get into, like, all of the different things? Like, do they look at 51% of the society, right? Like, are we a focus? We hadn't been a focus. I think it is, how many people say, like, you're one disaster away from, like, one medical incident away from, like, total life-changing choices.
From going to medical bankruptcy because people can't afford their bills. So it's just a huge and very interesting and very important topic. But to your other point about the pandemic, it's very interesting. I mean, I think as journalists, we were used to every day just going out and meeting our sources, meeting people we interview, coming into the office and mingling with our colleagues, our editors. And I think over the last 2.5 years, like many across the economy, across our societies, we had to work from home, and we learned how to do a lot of these things over Zoom. And I'd say there's been advantages and disadvantages. One thing that for me was helpful, because I'm a bit of an introvert, is that I get to spend my quiet time and really focus and read. Right. Sometimes in the office, it's just hard to do that.
Right.
And so that gives you time. That does give you time to, like, just sort of think and contemplate and research, and then in this hybrid world we live in now, also get into the city or wherever it is that you work, and still spend that time with the sources and people that you rely on.
I often wondered if writers were secretly just kind of happy also, because so many times you go to a coffee place, you go to a library, you go to any place, and they're like holding the corner, kind of, like they're writing, but they're also not really, like they're in their own, they're looking for a little nook to be. And so I thought, well, if you have to stay home and you have your own little office, well, in a way, you don't have to interact into the great big world. But I do miss the coffee, the water cooler conversations, right? Like, that's what I missed when we were at home, right? You can't see the children, have the children brush by you. You miss that connection point. I do feel like it's affected perhaps also like sometimes children's ability to focus. Like we're in like bite-sized communication moments. And so sometimes I feel like that's a bad thing for the reading and the writing part of our brains. Do you get distracted when you're writing more, do you find?
I think so, and even beyond COVID and
The
just
pace
the
of the
disruption.
world.
I just think the pace, the amount of distractions we have between the social
Right.
media that you mentioned earlier. I've got my when I'm working, I've got a couple screens, and I've got Twitter's on, and my email that perhaps someone's looking for me at work, and then my phone might be buzzing. So I think sometimes you have to put this stuff away.
Right.
I think what's important is like to not get into this sort of bite size and constant sort of distraction type of approach. It is good to sort of turn a bunch of stuff off and just zoom in if possible.
Do you read
Sure.
as a grown up? I mean, I know you read for work and you read this, but do you still enjoy like a novel, something else that's like not related to healthcare?
Yes. In fact, after a certain hours, I definitely try to, unless it's like a particularly, interesting book that I've been wanting to read, I try to, at some point just shift into other stuff. So yeah, I enjoy fiction. I enjoy nonfiction. It kind of depends on what mood I'm in.
There's a book for every mood.
Yes.
And there's a mood for every book.
Yes.
Right? So
well said by a librarian.
Yes. I say, you got 5 minutes, you got 50 minutes. I got something for you. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter. So I'm going to switch. Actually, I was thinking of some things, but then our conversation, I'm going to bring up, and you wrote an article in May of 2014. And it was, you wrote an article for Bloomberg titled, Israelis Without ABC's Unrated Power Startup Economy, Nation's Economy. And you said there was a lack of Shakespeare and English in the school curriculum. And that just like has been sitting with me a little bit because, sometimes I think people think we need hard-hitting topics, we need this stuff. I also tell kids, like, you need to read everything. The classics, the new stuff, because I always say it makes you a more interesting person. It just makes you someone I want to hang out with. I want to ask you questions. What do you like? What do you don't like? What's making you excited? Do you still have that thought that like we're missing out on an opportunity for Shakespeare, poetry, anything?
Yeah, and in the case of those schools that you mentioned, the ultra-Orthodox schools in Israel as well as sadly in New York, sometimes it's just basic things like math even, in addition to like, reading, basic English. Many of these kids are growing up without the basic writing and reading tools. So it's definitely, it's unfortunate. And it's, it's something that's depriving these kids of the tools they need to survive.
Right.
So yeah, it's.
Yeah, I mean, you live in a very much like a cutting edge journalistic world, but I still love to just take a moment and read fiction, right? Just step out of that, right? Like just read and hear how a story develops, right? Just read something that was written 200 years ago and then read something that's written, last month.
Right.
Like I find it's interesting, even if it has nothing to do with what's going on in the world. I think it always has something to do with the world, right? Or sometimes I read a good romance just because I want a very predictable plot, right? Like I don't want any surprises. Life is full of surprises. Some days I just want to read a beginning, middle, and end, and I know how it's going to end. It's going to end happy. I'm like, don't hate me because I like that, right? Sometimes I just need. That's why the Hallmark Channel's there, right? It's like sometimes people just need something that's like, oh, at the end I know it's going to be all good, right? We're going to work out enough problems that we can end it.
Right. Right. There's too much bad stuff going on in the news, and
yeah, and I like to. So I'm happy that you're a reader of fiction, in addition to a writer of nonfiction. Like to me, it's a good balance. Now, do you find as a parent, your own children enjoy reading? Like
they do.
I mean, I shouldn't ask it as a question. I've met them, and they have expressed their desire. But is there like sort of like a sacred time at night that there's like a sharing of literacy?
Yes. Yeah. No. So we definitely always try to read before bedtime. Sometimes it's me. Sometimes it's my wife. And as you know, because we're neighbors and you met my daughters recently. They just learned about chapter books.
Yes.
And they're really enthusiastic about it. And I think it's like it's super exciting for them because now we get to sort of like pick up
Yeah.
the same book for a few days straight.
Yeah.
They want to see what happens next. It's kind of like their version of sort of binging and streaming.
Yes. It's like just one more chapter.
Yeah, one more
right?
chapter.
Like
I'm
Netflix
like-
is really pushing me towards the next one, and like in the chapter, I said like that's the greatest thing when the author, you get to the end of the chapter and you're like, I just got one more in me. Right? Authors who write really long chapters are not maybe the authors that I want to pick up all the time because it's more like homework at times. Like, and trust me, I really like when they can develop a whole story and a plot and a setting, and that's really great. But again, in today's world of information and information overload, to me feels like, I'll only speak for myself, like sometimes a little bit shorter chapter is just what I need.
Right.
Like, I need to get down that rabbit hole of a story but not feel like I'm never coming out of it. Like I want the option to keep going.
Right. Yeah.
It's like a mental trick. It's like a mind game I play with myself as a reader. Now, I know they do this in some newspapers that you do not work for, like the New York Times. But if you could have a dinner party, is there anyone in the literary world you want to hang out with? You can invite anyone, dead, alive. I always find this interesting. Who would, and I change my mind all the time.
Yeah.
Like it's not like people say, "What's your favorite book?" I can't tell you, children. What's my favorite book today? Right this hour.
Right.
But next hour I might have a new, I'll forget. And I really like that book. Is there anybody in the literary world that you've ever, or any kind of author that you think their work is important? You'd want to talk more about it.
Well, there's
So many.
Yeah, so
There are
many,
so
and
many.
it depends kind of what time period. But one writer that I was very influenced by during my time in Israel and that I really liked is Amos Oz is his
Okay.
name. It's probably the most revered Israeli author, and he wrote a lot about sort of the transformation of the country from this embattled pre-state British mandate
Right.
territory to eventually becoming Israel, and he just wrote a lot about the different dynamics going on there, and so that'd be neat.
That would be a cool experience.
Yeah, but I've got different ideas. I mean, Leonard
it's so
Cohen's
hard.
another
It's
big
so hard.
hero. I mean, he's kind of a literary person also. Leonard Cohen, I said before. So I mean, a few different ideas.
Okay. I know I just got a Philip Roth novel that was gifted to me because I have actually never read Philip Roth. And another neighbor was like slightly offended, like not offended, but like really, you need to read Philip Roth. Next thing you know, it's a book is showing up on my on my doorstep. So like that's on my list of things to read. Somebody was mentioning to me the other day the work of Amor Towles, right? He read about the Moscow, A Gentleman in Moscow. And it's funny, I actually, instead of like even meeting the author, I want to go, well, if the world was more peaceful right now, I'd like to go to that hotel, right? Like I'd like to be in that setting. Like that room, being stuck in a room. Have you read that book, by the way?
No, I have not.
Wait, it's fascinating. The setting is what gets me on that book.
Yeah.
It's like he's stuck in this room. In a hotel, and sort of like you just by the end of the book you just want to spend some time there. You want to see his world. So maybe I would want to invite him so we could talk about that room and setting. So
You've given me some inspiration.
I know.
I'll have to check that out.
Our time is up. David, I thank you so much for having this conversation with us at Books in Action. Thank you, the audience. I'm Jennifer Latimer, and thank you for tuning in to Books in Action.